Hello, I'm Chris Cangilla here with my brother Ken Cangilla. Thanks for joining us for our World War II Dad in part two of our special episode about Dr. Raymond Minge, a doctor who served with the American Medical Corps and with our dad in Company C of the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate in Europe during World War II. Recently, Ken and I had the opportunity to sit down and chat with Dr. Minge's son, David, and Dr. Minge's grandson, Olaf.
That's right, Chris. In part one, we learn about Raymond and his family, including his sister, Margaret, who was in Germany right before the war began. And then the tragic circumstances of Captain Fisher's death that kept Dr. Minge with the 99th throughout the rest of the war.
Yeah, it's just an incredible, tragic turn of events that really changed the war for him and for so many others too, because he was there to provide aid to the soldiers that got wounded during all those campaigns. So let's get to part two of Dr. Raymond Minge's story here on Our World War II Dad. And it's a special time to do this episode because this is the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. And we commemorate the men that lost their lives and fought in that, and also the men that helped trying to save them and take care of them, which is so true of our story that's up next. Let's continue on. So let's move on to where we're going to talk a little about Würselen and Aachen and what happened then. Ken, share with us how you came to know those areas on your trip.
Yeah, so the thing that struck my interest in Würselen was in Howard Bergen's book that Dad had brought home or received after the war. Dad had noted Würselen, so I knew it meant a lot to him. So I really wanted to find out more about that. So Eric Brun put me in touch with Volker in Germany, who is, as you know, David, a local man who is another World War II reenactor, and he and I started a journey there. And you and I talked about it before you went so that you would be able to do the same things. So I want to dive into that with you, David, and get your experience of going through that with Volker. I know in looking at your pictures, he started with you similar to the way he started with me, as he got out a map of the area and he'd done all this research. Had he researched specifically kind of where Raymond was, or was he showing you just overall troop movements for the 99th?
It was more of the overall troop movements. He had some idea where, for the if different companies were in different areas, or if there was a frontline medical aid station where that would have been. But Volker, just a remarkable person. He's German, and he clearly is has a tremendous interest in the U.S. World War II effort, and very supportive of that. He has a Jeep, an American manufactured Jeep that he's restored. He has a Harley Davidson Army motorcycle that he's restored, and he has uniforms. And so he's very much equipped to portray the American side in these reenactments. He's cordial, and he gave us a wonderful tour. It was primarily a walking tour.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the uniforms because when Ken was there, it started to rain, Ken, and he had a whole uniform and the helmet and everything. And there's a photo of you in the helmet and the jacket or the long coat to keep the rain off of you. That's exactly the same as possibly our dad was wearing. One of the places that he took you that was very interesting to us, and he took Ken there the same place, is if you recall, there's a photo of a soldier kind of squatting down in this doorway. It's like a basement door looking up the road. And then down the road is this tank, this German tank coming down there.
Right.
And then on each side of the tank is other U.S. soldiers. And the tank, I think, was hit, right, Ken? And we're trying to figure out where this took place. And Ken, you have it how far away? And then let's talk about where David has it.
Yeah, so I compared your photos, David, from your trip to the photos I took at the time, and that you probably experienced this when you were there as I did. There's so much information that Volker's sharing with you. It's kind of hard to keep up and keep it straight in your head because you're not familiar with the area. But he showed me this picture of a C Company soldier that was standing in this basement doorway, and then he showed me a picture of the tank. And at the time he was explaining it to me, I thought that the tank was just up the road from there. But the photo I saw that you had, it appears that it must be even further up that road, or maybe even on a different road. Give us your interpretation of when Volker talked to you about that tank and where you were and what you were seeing.
Well, I'm not much help on this. We had so many things that Volker was showing us,
Yeah.
and I certainly do remember the photo that you have,
Hmm.
primarily from your podcast and how you covered it.
Hmm.
And we wanted to make sure that when we got there,
Yeah.
we were up to speed.
Good.
One thing I would say is that that area, Würselen, was built up as a residential neighborhood, and that existed at the time of World War II. So this was a self-contained village, and my recollection is that that's a higher elevation, and then down the hillside would be the transportation route that the Germans would expect to have as an escape route from Aachen. One thing that impressed me was that there's this very significant view when you're on the top of the hill, and you can see a great distance across the valley. And Volker pointed out how other American units were on the other side of the valley, and that they were enclosing this so-called escape route.
That's up
The
near Crucifix Hill, Ken. Is that where it was?
Yeah,
Up there?
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a cross up there, a crucifix. Another thing that struck me is that we said to Volker, it looks to us like they didn't have to have this campaign in Würselen because the U.S. Army was taking Aachen and closing all these escape routes anyway. This was like overkill, or we're duplicating each other. And he said, you have to remember that this was a massive movement, uh, tens of thousands of soldiers, and each unit had an assignment, and they had to keep up with the larger movement of the army. And they did not want any sort of rear guard risk that was left. And so they were determined whether it be the 99th or whatever unit was available would be put to the task of completing their encirclement of Aachen and taking everybody captive.
Because
Go ahead,
that
Ken.
road from Aachen that they're closing the gap on leads to Cologne, which
Right.
means there's a lot more Germans in Cologne could be headed that way. So the 99th had an important task there.
You're also
But
talking about communications too, guys.
yeah.
Like, we're thinking about this in communication terms of, 2024. It must have been a challenge to communicate with these larger units as well as the smaller units. So in our eyes, we go, that's overkill. They could have just, radioed to the guy, but that might have been more, challenging at
Well,
that point.
and even that communication was risky.
Right.
I think they were stringing wire through the woods. Uh, my wife made the mistake of asking Volker, "Are there any foxholes?" She wanted to see a foxhole,
Mm.
and we went on this extended hike down into the valley, and on a very sort of primitive trail. And we saw the countryside to an extent that I don't think Volker ever expected he'd be showing us.
Mm.
But Volker has hiked, I would say, almost every square meter of that countryside, and he knew the backstory on everything we saw.
Is that where the dragon teeth are, Ken, that you kind of,
It's part of the Siegfried line. It runs right through there, and of course, the Germans had all kinds of bunkers and things like that. And of course, the foxholes you saw, if they were foxholes, they were probably dug by the Americans because the Germans had fortified sites all over the place.
Yeah.
Now, David, one of the pictures you sent me that that was one I had never seen from Volker before, is a photo of American soldiers, and they're moving down the street, and they're spaced perfectly, and there's a hedge that they're kind of looking around and looking over for the enemy. And then you also gave us the photo of the current scene, which is very idyllic household neighborhood. Do you recall that photo in the conversations you and Volker had around that area?
I don't recall that with any specificity, but I certainly know that I was surprised that that area appeared as prosperous
Hmm.
and clean
Hmm.
as it was when we saw it. The fact that there had been a military campaign through there and then extensive damage, you had no clue that that had happened. And
It's
my guess is that the people that live there now, they might know something from a history book, but anybody that's under 70, this is kind of like beside the point in their life.
Yeah, that
But
photo was so remarkable that Ken and I saw, because you mentioned, the modern day, you see this, this nice house and this beautiful hedge is still there, and people may,
Yeah,
like you said, live there that have no idea that outside of their window, back in the 1940s during the war, the American soldiers were using it as cover. We think we counted about 9 soldiers spaced
hmm
out and yeah, every
yeah,
10, 15 feet going
hmm
down the line of the sidewalk. It was
yeah,
remarkable.
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, great photo. Now you talk about people not being aware of the damage, but I don't know if you had a chance with Volker. Did he take you by Saint Sebastian's church, the one that was
Yes.
so heavily shelled? And you can still see the battle damage in that. Isn't that correct, David?
Yeah, yeah. He showed us the church. In fact, we met him there in front of the church, and the church is, basically restored, but that community is um, the historic part of it. You can still tell that was a location of some of this conflict.
Yeah, you look at the door to the church, and the cornerstones around the front door still have battle damage in them because those stones were never removed or refaced. So it's very evident of the terrific combat that took place around that church.
One of the places that I did see that you guys visited was the Henri-Chapelle cemetery,
Yeah.
where a lot of the Americans and a lot of other servicemen are buried. What was your take on that?
Well, it's a beautiful rural setting. There are hundreds, maybe several thousand graves. So it's a very extensive expanse. And they have a cemetery office area with a museum. But unfortunately, we got there at the end of the day and none of that was open. Captain Fisher's remains were moved to that cemetery, and then they were eventually sent back to the United States. Um, but the cemetery figured, at least to that extent, into the 99th, and it could be that there are other 99th men who were killed that are buried there.
In fact, Folker takes care of 6 graves there as part of his remembrance of the U.S. effort there, which I think is highly admirable.
It really is.
So let's move on, gentlemen, to the big part of, I think, the most major campaign for the 99th is, of course, the Battle of the Bulge.
The Battle of the Bulge was so chaotic and such a challenge to understand. There is a wonderful museum at Bastogne
Hmm.
that depicts what they call it the Ardennes campaign. And the Ardennes is really the hilly area of Belgium where the Battle of the Bulge was concentrated. And so I would highly recommend to anybody that they take a half a day and go through that museum at Bastogne in order to have a more coherent understanding of how all these places fit together.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think when we think about the Battle of the Bulge, and of course, Ken and I think, we knew Dad was there, but the Band of Brothers, mini
Mhm.
series and episodes really brought that home to us. And I was looking at the Bergen book Olaf. And in that book, we see there's a story of soldiers because they're in Malmedy in December, mid-December, right before Christmas, and you see how they spent Christmas. Like we talked about before, Raymond thought maybe the year before he'd be sending some presents, and
Yeah.
now here he's in the thick of it. And now we see these guys having, K rations, just sharing that underneath some kind of bridge. And it's remarkable to us because in that Bergen book, we see that. And then Ken saw another photo, right, from David's trip that kind of reminded you of that.
Yeah, there's a photo, David, that was in the collection that you were able to send us that shows an overpass, and you guys are standing beneath it, and it's a railroad. I don't know if the railroad goes over and the road goes under back in the day.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that picture was taken at the same place where the picture in Bergen's book is, where they're eating their K rations right around Christmas. Do you know? Can you tell us about that visit there?
Well, it very likely was. That was an important site for the 99th. What it is, it's a railroad that passes through the area, was at one point a critical German railroad line. And the problem was that they had to have a few roads that would go somehow through that railroad. And this was a viaduct under the tracks. Ironically, today it's a bike trail, hiking. So it's like here in the States, rails to trails.
Hmm.
But you could see that the railroad right away was elevated. You could not drive a tank up and over that right away. And if, as a military unit, you tried to go over the right of way and advance, the infantry men in the unit would be mostly killed. I mean, it was an amazing defensive position, and the 99th capitalized on that and were able to use that to protect themselves from German troops that were attempting to advance and to wipe them out.
That's
So,
interesting.
David, this is really important to me because it was a key part of my journey was understanding Malmedy and this railroad arch that you took the picture with. There's basically two major roads kind of in and out of Malmedy. One heads, back towards Tilf. The other one heads towards where the Malmedy massacre took place.
Mhm.
So the picture that you have of the arch there, that the underpass of the railroad line, was that closer to the road that goes towards Tilf, or the other road that's heading out towards where the Malmedy massacre was?
I regret I can't give a decent answer to that. We did go to the massacre site,
Hmm.
but none of those roads are like through roads or significant roads today. And so we traveled by different routes. And I was surprised at the complexity of the street pattern in the Malmedy area. And I even had a time trying to keep north and south straight. Um, but it's Malmedy was tragic from several perspectives. For the Americans, the massacre was so impossible to understand. How would you shoot down 125 or more American soldiers essentially in cold blood? Just open fire, force them to line up, stand up, and kill them. And there was a famous trial that followed as a part of the war crimes trials. And that Malmedy massacre site has a significant memorial, and I understand the memorial is being rebuilt
Hmm.
and it's going to be enlarged, and that the actual site where the men were killed is being added. It's currently under private ownership.
That's
Um, so
it's
I mean, that's one thing. The center of the of old Malmedy has a church which was badly damaged, and ironically, Malmedy was uh, more of a defensive position that the Americans and the Belgians were able to hold, and there was confusion, and American bombing planes came over and bombed Malmedy, killing several American soldiers. and also killing a significant number of civilians in Malmedy. So
Yeah,
that's another tragedy that the people of Malmedy never seemed to be bitter in anything that we could perceive, but on the other hand, it was extremely unfortunate.
you speak of marking these sites and having memorials, and I want to talk about that in a moment. But let's get back to the massacre for 1 second, because in my research and what I saw, there's an illustration of the massacre, and it has what was going on. And one of the gentlemen in the illustration is has a Red Cross on his, his
Right.
hat or whatever. And I'm like, wow, it got me thinking about this. And Olaf, you may know a little bit more because I think in your editing of the Viking Battalion that you had some of these stories in there. Your grandfather, I think, treated some of the guys from that massacre, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, and the massacre, of course, was a fatal event for nearly all of the men. There were just a couple that survived, and they did it largely. They were shot, but they played dead. And the German soldiers walked over and back and forth and shot multiple times, but somehow just a few men did survive, and one crawled out under cover of night, spent the night in a nearby barn, and then it was either the next day or the day after was stumbled upon by some soldiers of the 99th. And my grandfather Raymond Minge was the first doctor to see this man. His name is Zack Taylor, and Zack Taylor survived his injuries and then lived out the rest of his life in Wisconsin. And there's a book written about his experiences and the treatment that he got from Captain Minge right after the
So when you
massacre.
when you were researching this and putting this all together, that story you just told, did that come from the survivor, or did that come from your grandfather, or did it come from somewhere else?
Well, it came from a few places. One, when we gave a talk at the Minnesota Military History Talk series that you guys attended, um, afterwards, a gentleman introduced himself and said that he knew Zack Taylor. Zack Taylor, only passed away 15, 20 years ago. So knew Zack Taylor, knew the story, and knew that there was a connection with this 99th. And he sent me a transcript of an interview done with Zack Taylor, and it describes from Zack Taylor's own words what happened during this wartime atrocity. And so
Incredible.
very, very compelling and shocking stories, of course, throughout the war. And this is definitely one of them.
And your grandfather treated him, and as I read the story, the man's leg was shot so terribly, your grandfather wasn't sure if he was going to be able to keep it or not. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And
A- a-
he said that this is you're going home now, son. This is the end of
Yeah.
your wartime. And he had that injury throughout his life. And so in the transcript of the interview with him, as an elderly gentleman, he was still having difficulties with his leg and going into the VA periodically for treatment and deep infection that lasted through his whole life.
You mentioned
Yeah, and
something very interesting. I'm sorry, Ken. You mentioned something interesting where you said, yeah, you're going home, son. Well, your
Yes,
grandfather was probably what, 30 or 31. These guys
right.
were, 19, 20. It's
Yeah.
it's it's what struck Ken and I, and especially me, is we always personally, I always thought these guys were a lot older, watching
Hmm.
these films and documentaries because they had such a responsibility. They were in their 30s but there's 18, 19-year-old kids. So to your grandfather who has been through it a little bit more, he's a father himself. He kind of said, "Yeah, you are going home, son," and
Yeah.
it was that kind of relationship. Ken, you were going to say something. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
that's all right. Yeah. So, David, having traveled in that area and been out to the Malmedy Massacre site, and it's called that, but it really happened in a town called Baugnez, which is up the road. Having driven that road, and I'm sure you guys, I don't know if you drove it or biked it, but the distance from Baugnez to Malmedy was not like walking across the street. It was quite a distance. And for this man to have survived that shooting, gotten through the night, and then probably practically crawled his way to Malmedy is really hits home when you've been in that area, doesn't it, David?
It makes an impression on you to think of the struggle for life that compelled or drove these men to not only escape, but to continue to this will to live. Um, and today, Malmedy has kind of expanded, and there are roads out there, and there's development along the roads, which is almost continuous. And we discovered some interesting things in Belgium that there are incentives for these villages to combine and establish one larger unit of government. They get more favorable treatment from the central government. And so what we found, or what I found, is that many of the designations that are in these historic materials are difficult to pin down when you're over there today, because the names don't necessarily survive, or if they do, they are playing a different role.
Another government movement, but a government movement almost led by some of the citizens, is that they're doing more markers, more memorials. And of course, many of us belong to the Facebook page for the 99th Infantry Battalion separate. And then there's a gentleman who I think kind of helped you out, David, that is maybe putting up some more markers at the town square, where the obelisk is, and
Yeah.
at the bombing site of the church. Do you remember that gentleman was with you for a
Yeah.
little bit, right?
In fact, the gentleman who's really invested his time and become an expert on the 99th is not truly bilingual, and he has a friend who's done the same thing at another location and the Battle of the Bulge. And that friend came along, and that friend was very articulate and is also knowledgeable. And so we had the benefit of these two guides, and it was a charmed opportunity for us.
And Ludovic is one of the gentlemen that you're referencing, David, that gave you the tour. And so what I did in advance of David's trip is contact the two of you, but also others, Eric Brun, other board members that have been to the area, and identified not only the people that David went and visited in the sites, but we now have a page on our 99th Educational Foundation website with an inventory of where all the 99th markers and memorials are around the world, with geolocated maps and then where we can contact information for people, and hopefully that makes it easier for others to then recreate these trips with a little less homework needed in the advance to figure out where to go and what to see.
Before we move on, just one follow-up for you, Olaf, regarding Ludovic. Do we know where his interest in the Malmedy sites comes from? Does he have a relative? Is he just a World War II buff? Do you know why he has taken this great interest in what took place in that area?
I don't know the origin story for Ludovic. I think that I do know that he has been involved with 99th history for quite some time. There have been organized trips that have occurred over the last several decades, and he and some of the others have been part of those past tours. I think part of it is just trying to better understand the local community and the history.
Yeah.
And finding these unique and compelling stories, and then researching, and then making connections with family and descendants.
Yeah, that's
One
true.
of them. One of them is trying to establish a museum that would have some focus on the 99th, and we brought over parts of a uniform that was being donated for use in that museum. So whether it's going to take a year or more to get that actually up and operating, I don't know.
Yeah, and that's Ludovic.
Yeah, okay.
So another important event for Raymond's experience with the 99th was his trip to Buchenwald, and he writes home about that. David, tell us what his thoughts of Buchenwald were.
Well, he was shocked at what they saw at Buchenwald, and they were detailed to go to Buchenwald, I think a day or maybe a day and a half after it was, so to speak, liberated. So they were not there uh, arresting Germans and carting the Germans off, but instead they saw these victims. They were walking skeletons. They saw piles of skeletons. And I know that one comment that my dad made ultimately was that having seen Buchenwald, he knew why we fought World War II.
Wow.
The cruelties, the inhumanity, um, and the human suffering came alive at Buchenwald.
I can only imagine too, as a medical doctor, that might hit a little harder because you take this oath to do everything you can to save lives, and it just must have hit him very, very hard, as it does anyone, but especially somebody trying to
It's
treat
my
people.
understanding that Eisenhower had determined that every unit ought to have some exposure to the concentration camps. And so turned out the 99th was in that area right on the heels of its liberation. So
Hmm.
they visited the camp when all of the evidence was present and it was recent and fresh. Um, but Eisenhower was determined that the American soldiers understand what the Nazi regime stood for.
Yes,
Mhm.
you make a good point on that too. All right, so let's change subjects a little bit and move on to. I know, Ken, you didn't have an opportunity to go there. I think, David, you're only out on the outskirts of it, the Merkers Mine. And for many people that may not know exactly what that is, and Ken, I'll need your help on this a little bit, but as I recall, that's where all the stolen artwork and all those things the Nazis had were stored in this salt mine. And the Americans, once they took control of that land, found a lot of these things, and the 99th were part of the transportation of getting those items back to where they belong.
Yeah.
Olaf, why don't you jump in and tell us about the role the 99th played in that, and then David, maybe you can tell us what it was like to be in that area and what it
Mhm.
felt like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the story is certainly a compelling one, and the Monuments Men movie with Matt Damon and George Clooney dramatized the effort from at least a small group or a faction of the Allies to preserve and try to collect and protect the artwork and gold that had been stolen. And Merkers Mine indeed was one location in which a vast amount of this artwork was being stored, and it was at risk of falling under Russian hands. And so the Allies were under some urgent effort to extricate the artwork and preserve it. The 99th was enlisted to be the vehicle transport for the artwork, and so the vehicles that the 99th had as part of its unit were used to transport this artwork out of that area. And so that's one of the many sort of connections to historical fame that the 99th has.
So, David, you were outside of it, is that right?
Well, we got into the office building. Turns out that Merkers Mine is deep underground. The mine shaft and the equipment to reach the levels where all of these things were being stored or hidden um, was complicated. And today, the mine is still operating.
Wow.
And so there's a German company that is in charge, but they do have public tours because it became famous as a result of, I'm sure, before the Monument Men.
Right.
The trouble is, the tours are, at least when we were there, they're not in English.
Hmm.
And we were told, well, you'll see everything and it'll be obvious what was going on. Uh, but then we didn't have a reservation, and the tours were filled up with apparently German tourists. And so here we were in October, and we couldn't get on a tour unless we came back 2 days later, and that would have interrupted our opportunity to see Malmedy and other spots.
Right.
So
You know,
we took pictures of the office building and the mine shaft above ground, and waved goodbye to Merkers Mine.
yeah, you
That,
bring up a very interesting point that these stories are kind of told in Hollywood,
yeah,
and that got me thinking, and Ken and I talked about this a little bit. Merker's Mine, Hollywood movie, Band of Brothers and Bastogne, that's the Battle of the Bulge. Each one of these places kind of sets up in our mind that the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate was kind of like the, Forrest Gump of the whole experience. They got to do some incredible things
yeah,
as a small unit that you hear about, and then you go, oh my goodness, they were there too? Or they
yeah.
did that too? That's a feeling I got. Olaf, do you ever get that feeling?
Oh, most definitely. And of course, we've got some bias because it's a group that we're connected with.
Of
But
course.
there's so many historical interesting elements that the 99th touched, and including the origins of the special forces, with men from the 99th being a critical core part of the beginning of the U.S. Special Forces missions. So yes, many, and part of it is because of the small nature of the group. They could be used as somewhat of a easily tasked unit to attach with another group or to provide some assistance
Yeah, you
here or
mentioned
there.
we talked about the how they are folded into the 474th, and part of their new insignia is Darby's Rangers. There's a
Mm.
part of that on there. So it's these
Yeah,
incredible historical things that people hear about. Our dads were there. It's
yeah.
it's
Mhm.
it's incredible to me, and I love that part of it. Ken?
Yeah, so David, I know on this trip, I don't believe you got to Norway. You had a lot of other things you were doing. Is that correct?
No, we didn't, but my wife and I and our family, we've been to Norway many times, and so we felt that we wouldn't be able to squeeze that in.
Right.
The thing is that we learned, towards the end of their campaign that what they were built for was going to Norway, and the 99th actually got there and were there when the king returned from exile. Now, a significant thing to my father, he was all he spoke about was about Norway, but he wasn't Norwegian. Your relatives were, so I could only imagine that was a big thing. I know your father and grandfather didn't speak of it that much, but did was that a big deal to them, Olaf or David? What do you think?
Well, well, most definitely. And as David mentioned earlier, 30 or 40% of the 99th was comprised of Norwegians. And so for some of these soldiers, they were going home and able to see their parents and relatives for the first time since Germany occupied Norway several years earlier. And then for others like Raymond Minge, it was an opportunity to visit uncles and great uncles and aunts, and it was a very positive time for those that had Norwegian background. But for the soldiers that weren't Norwegian, it was still
Powerful.
a good time. And so I'm sure your father had stories. I know that Donald Curtis is one of the 99th members that just passed away this summer. He was not Norwegian. He had been added to the group relatively early, but as a non-Norwegian, he always resented being with all these Norwegians and getting treated as sort of a second class since he wasn't Norwegian. Couldn't get promoted, always got sent on the difficult details. And then while they were in Norway, not unique to him, but he did end up meeting a woman. They started dating, and sure enough, she moved to the U.S. and they got married. So at the end of the day, he got his Norwegian card, so to
Yes, he
speak,
did.
through marriage, and so it was a joyous time for Norwegians and the men in this unit to really recognize what they had achieved and how this country was then turning around after Nazi occupation.
Ken and I didn't bring this up in our previous podcast, but we did discuss it. That my experience, and I think Ken has the same one of Norway during World War II, was a children's book called, I think, Snow Treasure, where the children used the sleds to get gold out of Norway during Nazi Germany. They'd lay on this blanket and on the sled and all that kind of stuff. So, we had this love affair with Norway before we even knew any of this stuff as children, because that was a really interesting story for us.
And I want to ask too about Raymond's homecoming in Minnesota, and what that was like, and if there's any recollections of what that was like for him to finally come all the way home to Minnesota from having been in all these places across the European continent.
Well, I was, I suppose, 5 years old when he came home, and my recollection of it is pretty dim. And I just know that my mother and his parents and the rest of his family were overwhelmed that here he was safe, he was not injured, and he was able to resume his career. He was accepted into a residency program and trained as a surgeon and became a board-certified surgeon. And that was basically his career in a smaller city, multi-specialty clinic here in Minnesota. But his interest in mission work is not something that he forgot. And when he was about 60 years old, he went to Liberia, and he spent 4 years in Liberia before all of the turmoil in that country, but at a hospital essentially in the jungle. And there were two surgeons, and they were kept busy. And following that, he came back to the States, practiced medicine for a couple of years, and then he went to Bangladesh, where he was supposed to oversee the establishment of a hospital that was under construction. And he was the only doctor at that time. He was operating an outpatient clinic, and my mother said there could be as many as 200, 300 people lined up to see him in the morning when they opened the doors. And he would be lucky if he could get through half of the people that were lined up. And after about a month of that work, he had a heart attack, and he died there in Bangladesh and is buried at the hospital. So he got his foreign experience in spades, but he never was interested in going back to Europe, and he never went back to Norway, much to my surprise.
Yeah, it seems like he had a lifetime of service, not only his military service, but service to the common man, and then those that really needed the help in these foreign countries. He seemed like an incredible man with that kind of, this is what I'm going to do for these people, and it's remarkable.
Well, he's very soft-spoken and very modest about it. He never talked to the four of us kids in the family, trying to inspire us to do this or to do that. Whatever we picked up would be from example. By contrast, my mother she could be after us on a weekly basis, trying to build a fire under us to work on this or that. But that was not his character.
Well, it seemed like his character did rub off on you with your years of service in the government, and then Olaf, your years of service of putting together these stories and the foundation and all those things that you have done. So it rubbed off on you guys a little bit. Ken?
Yeah, it's great to hear about Raymond's life as your World War II dad, David, and your World War II grandfather, Olaf. He didn't talk about it, but his letters home were so well written and so insightful. It was great to get a chance to read through those and see the world through a 29-year-old man's eyes as he was experiencing it is really nice to be able to read. And then to hear of your experiences in your travel, David, is just fantastic since we walked that same hallowed ground together. It just brings new meaning to it. So, I'm proud of my father. I'm sure you're proud of your father and your grandfather. They did what they were asked to do. To them, it was just doing their job, but we know it had to be a tough life for them, and I think we're all very proud of what they accomplished.
I'd add one other thing. I was curious, Dad, what did you do during the war? But there were 2 footlockers up in the attic, and I used to go up there as a kid, and I would get canteens and cook kits and so on that I would use as a Boy Scout. And there were some kind of cheap sleeping bags. And remember saying or hearing him say that he had a nice down sleeping bag when he was in Colorado. And he took that to Europe and he lost it in the Battle of the Bulge. If I went to Boy Scout camp and came home and said I lost my sleeping bag, nobody would think that that was understandable. It'd be like I was really sloppy, and I could never understand until I watched the Band of Brothers how he could lose a sleeping bag in the Battle of the Bulge.
Wow.
Yeah, when I think about your father and the Band of Brothers, there's a whole episode of a medic going back and forth from the front line to the aid station, all that kind of stuff, and that's kind of what I think about. Why David holds up? Is that his uniform there?
Well, this is his uniform from World War II, and my brother had it, and my brother loaned it to me yesterday. You can see the shoulder patch.
Yeah.
And then there's a second shoulder
The
patch.
99th, yeah,
For
absolutely.
the 99th. And there's a cap with the military insignia on the front.
Wow.
But I never saw my father wear this. And
the photo in this book, is he wearing that same, Olaf, you would know that. There's that one photo in this book that has.
I believe he's wearing an overcoat in the.
But
does
he have his hat on?
Yeah,
we'll put that up there and we'll see if that's true. But what an incredible thing to be able to have that. I know, Ken, we have Dad's jacket, and it has really given us a point for us to learn more about him by just kind of diving into that. Now, before we let you guys go, Olaf, where can people find this book?
Yes.
It's fabulous.
Well, yeah, the Viking Battalion is a book that we put together. 90% of the content is writing from the men of the unit that we edited, added context. Big thanks to the families and for sharing the content in there. It is on Amazon. We also have our website for the foundation, 99battalion.org. And on that website, you can also order the book.
Let's talk a little bit as we leave about the foundation and what's going on with that.
Right. So the 99th Infantry Battalion has an educational foundation. It started out as a reunion group, and so the men that were in the 99th would coordinate reunions every 5 years, 10 years, some were annual, and then of course as time passes, so do the men from the 99th, and it turned more into an ancestor group. We rebranded it the Educational Foundation. It is a nonprofit. We've had tremendous leadership from other descendants with the group. I'm now the president of this foundation, and we have not only the website with a wealth of resources, including access to other books that have been written about the 99th. There's a DV documentary that has been produced about the group, and we host different educational events. And probably the most compelling thing that we have is our Facebook group. There are over 2,500 people that are now following our Facebook group, and almost on a nearly daily basis, there are people asking questions, posting information, people that want to learn more about their grandfather. Just, they raise a hand and say, hey, my grandfather was so-and-so. Yeah. Does anybody have information? And it's amazing how quickly people come back and provide support.
You're absolutely right. I know, speaking for Ken and then, keying me in on it, it was a wealth of information to start his journey in Europe. I want you to do two things. First of all, I want to thank you for including Our World War II Dad as part of the videos that people can watch on the Foundation's website. Give us that website again so that we can make sure people can find it.
Yep. So it's the 2 digits, 99battalion.org. So 99battalion.org.
And thank you for your work on that. And gentlemen, before I turn it over to Ken, thank you for joining us on Our World War II Dad. It's our first of having a grandson and a son. on our podcast and talking about somebody that might have bumped into our dad when they're over in Europe. So your time and your insight and what you both have done is really helpful to us, and we can't thank you enough. Ken?
Yeah, Olaf, the work you do on behalf of the foundation is terrific and is so helpful for people like me that just kind of began this search to understand my dad's history. So it's quite helpful and it's just interesting reading, even if you're not related to a 99th Infantry Battalion soldier. It's a really important part of history. And David, thank you for sharing your experience with us, your travels with us, and helping us get to know your father Raymond and what his experiences were like. We very much enjoyed speaking with you.
Well, thank you. And thanks for what you're doing. You've put together some marvelous material, and my wife and I watched every minute of it before we went overseas.
Well, thank you
Terrific.
for doing that. Yeah, we appreciate it. It's I think all of us can say when it's associated with our fathers and grandfathers, it's a labor of love that isn't work at all. When we dive into it, it's something that we feel we need to do. So thank you both for being with us here today and sharing your stories.
Thank you so much.
You know, Chris, it was amazing to me that Dr. Minge was the medical professional on duty when that survivor of the Malmedy Massacre basically crawled his way back to Malmedy and was taken care of by Dr. Minge.
And you made a very interesting point too. You think about crawling back somewhere. It was so far that the soldier had to crawl back to get aid after he kind of laid low until everything kind of calmed down. And then he had to crawl back and get aid. And it's just, I know he's very wounded, but he did survive. So an incredible story there. Yeah.
Yes, he did. And you got to, thank Dr. Minge for his survival. I'm sure the treatment he gave him helped immediately. And we're lucky to have that man's story and that he could attest to what took place during that time.
Yeah, they needed those stories because, it was kind of an unheard thing that happened, the brutality of that attack. And I don't know if we would know as much if guys like that didn't survive. So, yeah, absolutely.
You bet. And then on a lighter note, it was great to hear about Dr. Minge's chance to go to Norway with the rest of the 99th. We know it made a big impression on our dad when he went there, even though he's not Norwegian.
No.
But for Dr. Minge, he got the chance to see relatives of his family that he may not have met before and get to enjoy some time doing that as they kind of took care of cleanup operations there. And then eventually he gets his chance to go home to Minnesota, get his practice underway, and he becomes a surgeon and continues to take care of people throughout the rest of his medical career.
And that interesting story of when he had to take care of somebody who might have been on the other side of the law that was brought into his hospital, and somebody he recognized, which was another veteran from World War II. And matter of fact, he was in Company C, or even just the 99th, with our father and, of course, Dr. Raymond Minge. And so that was just an incredible story where they recognize each other, and he continues to give aid to whoever comes across his path. Ken, meeting these World War II sons that we've talked to on this podcast, and there seems to always be this through line that still seems to appear that even with guys like Dr. Minge and writing those letters home and they got published in the newspaper, they still don't talk about the war with the people that are close to them, their families. They just are quiet about it. And we haven't unlocked that just yet, but hopefully we'll find out maybe why that is a little bit more.
Yeah, David mentioned it a number of times when we talked to him about how his father, Raymond, even though he had written those letters, didn't talk about it at home. You and I both know our dad only talked about the lighter things, as we've discussed before. And so many of these soldiers, that was the case for them. So I would encourage anybody who has a living World War II relative, they're going to be in their 90s, almost 100 now. If you can sit down and talk to them, please gather some information. Or if they've passed, but their son or daughter is still alive and you're a younger person, talk to them as well and see what they learned over time and maybe what's in the memorabilia, because it's important to share that with each generation.
You're exactly right. And it's incredible to share that now more than ever because we're on an important anniversary that really means a lot to you and I and to the men that were there, right?
That's right, Chris. This podcast is airing at the exact same time as the Battle of the Bulge took place 80 years ago. So I think it's important for us to remember those men who were fighting in the cold and the snow as we enter this holiday season, and take a moment to remember them and remember the sacrifices they all made for us back in 1944.
Yeah, you speak the truth, brother. You really do. And we've learned a lot about these men, but we have to learn more to keep their stories alive. So we'd love to hear from you. Please drop us a comment below on YouTube, or leave us a review on the audio podcast, or even send us a message at ourWWII@gmail.com. So that's RWW, the number 2, DAD@gmail.com. So for my brother Ken Cangilla, I'm Chris Cangilla. We can't thank you enough for staying with us through our World War II Dad.
Thanks for watching and listening to Our World War II Dad. Please remember to like and subscribe, and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss an episode.
And if you're just listening to the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate it.